Hey guys, and welcome back to the podcast. There is no new episode today, and I do realize that you probably did click on this thinking that this might be a new episode, and it actually isn't, but let me explain. So this week I decided not to do a podcast. I honestly just need to sort of recalibrate and refresh myself for the next week so I can actually make some decent stuff still. I didn't want to really take a break, but I thought it was a good idea to do so anyway. So what I have done for YouTube, because now we have a YouTube channel, what I've done is that I've combined both parts of my Vinland Saga analysis that I did that was only on podcast apps. And so if you do want to listen to this, it would be very cool if you did. And maybe you haven't even listened to it before, so that would also be quite cool as well. And yeah, this is an episode I did in summer of 2020. It was probably one of the more well-researched episodes of the pod, where we speak a lot about Canute and Askeladd and all these things in regards to Vinland Saga Season 1. So that is going to play after this message, and I will hopefully see you next week. Remember, this is 2 parts, so there will be me in the middle just saying part 2, and then there'll be an outro by me in the future in this episode too. But with that being said, enjoy the podcast, and thank you for tuning in for another week. This is Get In The Mecha, the weekly anime and manga show where we take things one step further. I analyze everything from arcs to OPs to episodes in my wacky but enjoyable quest to make sense of all of it. Welcome back to Get In The Mecha. I'm your host Jamal today, and in today's episode I bring you a 2-part Vinland Saga philosophy episode thing. In today's episode and next episode, I will be looking at some of the discourse in regards to what is beauty in Vinland Saga. And I'll come clean, this was not supposed to be a 2-part episode. This was supposed to be one whole episode and then we'll get it done and over with. But I ended up writing a bit more than I should have, and I kind of wanted to expand on my thoughts in some areas. And so this is going to be a 2-parter. In this first part, I'm going to be speaking about Askeladd and what he has to say in regards to aesthetics and what is beauty in Vinland Saga. And then in the next episode, I'll be talking about the almost opposite discourse or opposite commentary, which is Canute's take on what is beauty and where that comes from. So in episode 46 here today, I want to talk about Askeladd in relation to Stoicism and Stoic philosophy, how he fits into that, and how his actions reflect the Stoic commentary on one's behavior. I also want to talk about how smart Askeladd really is for applying this philosophy. I want to talk a bit about history, not necessarily history in the way of which we think of it, but history conceptually. And just a few more things here and there to sort of flesh out the philosophy that Askeladd has. If you do enjoy today's episode, feel free to leave a review, whether that's on Apple Podcasts or wherever you do get your podcasts. And so let's just get into today's episode. Here is episode 46 of Get In The Mecha. It feels like it's still 45, but here's episode 46 of Get In The Mecha. A look at Askeladd's commentary on beauty in Vinland Saga. Before we dive in too quickly, I should always give you my alerts, as I usually do in these normal episodes. That will be spoilers for the war arc of Vinland Saga. If you aren't aware of where the war arc is, that is the first season of Vinland Saga. I'm sure if you do read the manga, you're probably more aware of the arc structure, but if you aren't aware, it's the prologue of the story of which I'll be speaking about. I have not read the manga, and so I'm not analyzing this from hindsight. I'm analyzing it with my knowledge of the anime. I'm going to be, for this 2-parter, going to be focusing on 2 specific moments. However, these do kind of overlap across the show as themes don't really stop in their respective episodes, and so there may be plot details from across the arc, and that is why I'm saying spoilers for the entire arc rather than just the 2 speeches and commentaries. So to start today's episode, I should probably set the scene, not in relation particularly to Vinland Saga and where we are temporally in regards to the anime, but more of what does this arc represent as a whole and what is its function. And many do refer to this as almost the world building arc. It's the prologue to the story, and hence we need to introduce how a society and how this almost self-contained world of the Vikings works. And I do agree that it does do that quite well, and it's a good way of understanding contextually how the Dark Ages works, as the Dark Ages in history is a time of which we don't know how it actually happened, hence the Dark Ages. Or I do mean more, we don't really know specifically all of the events that happened. A lot of knowledge was lost in the Dark Ages, and that is why it's given that title. Hence, what many do refer to as the function for this arc is to, for the further arcs, introduce us to the society and the mechanisms of which the society is based on. And as I said, I do agree, but I also would say that the emphasis should be shifted slightly from just how a society functions. So, as I said earlier, the world building arc or the society building arc, I feel as if this emphasis should be shifted slightly to the arc of which constructs the discourses of this time period. It introduces us to these philosophical discourses and commentaries on the focus of this episode, what is beauty, and aesthetic philosophy. Aesthetic philosophy being on the philosophies in regards to beauty and sublimity and art, those sorts of things. It introduces us and widens our scope of this way of life, which many claim this arc is meant to do. And so I would say that this is, and the focus of this episode is to build on that analysis in relation to what this world and how it functions. There's a philosophical layer which we can add to this, because these systems almost transcend one single society and a group of people. These themes, these philosophies will underpin and undercut, to my assumption, everything which comes after it. Similarly to how we looked at Attack on Titan philosophy previously. It will undercut everything which happened previously and after, and I am very sure the Vinland Saga will do the same. I think a really good place to attack this philosophy and these discourses across these two episodes is to remember that this is within the Dark Ages. As I said just a few minutes ago, that this is a time of which a lot of information was lost in history, and we don't necessarily know exactly what happened in this piece of time because a lot of things weren't documented. And also remembering its time relative to where we are today, aesthetic philosophy didn't necessarily come as far as we know now. When we think of it, we didn't have people like Immanuel Kant writing things on aesthetics, who's written 3 critiques, one of which being a massive critique on aesthetics, or at least a commentary, I should say, on beauty and art and sublimity. He didn't have that input because he wasn't alive then. People like Thomas Aquinas, who is more on the theological side, wasn't able to comment then again because he wasn't alive then. This wasn't the time of which he was writing. That will become a bit more relevant in relation to Canute, but the point still stands. And so I guess you can still say, and I still think it is being carved out today, but aesthetic philosophy is something which was very up in the air at this time and was something to be carved out. Most of the discourse in Vinland Saga feels rather in flux, and that applies to today's episodes and my analysis, because as I just mentioned, these are times of which people aren't writing. Some of the many notions that we take in relation to art and beauty that we take for granted and apply to our own discourse didn't exist then, and so these are people actively trying to mold that and carve it out for themselves and gain some understanding, or at least make their own path in relation to it. I would even go as far as arguing that history itself is something for the molding at this time of Vinland Saga, and I'll go into that. But generally within time, history, if we think of it conceptually rather than the scientific sense, it is something to be molded and it's something to be influenced. And this is where a lot of this influence, quote unquote influence, is coming in. And so that leads us nicely to Askeladd, and Askeladd's activities in episode 22 of Vinland Saga, which he gives a very extensive speech. And I think this is probably one of my favorite moments of the entire anime so far. He approaches his speech from what seems to be a sort of secular or pagan perspective, not really one of which is religious. That is contrasted to Canute, who gives a much more theologically based answer in relation to what is beauty, but as I've said a billion times, that will be in the next part. It's good to also factor in his Roman heritage, as that will influence his discourse in relation to Stoicism, as I'll get into today. But I think that also causes him to attack this from a much more detached perspective. You can view Askeladd almost as the odd one out. He's the Roman out of the Vikings who still rolls with the Vikings, but has a almost very different outlook to life and what life is all about. And so the basis of his criticism in relation to beauty and the Vikings more specifically is that lacking beauty often comes around from giving into self-destructive behaviors. He has a very negative criticism. It's more emissive as opposed to constructive and adding on to what beauty is. It's more of saying what beauty is not. And you can kind of imply as a result to what beauty is from what Askeladd says. And so I've deduced that what Askeladd tries to say in episode 22 is that lacking beauty comes from an almost lack of autonomy, a lack of personal autonomy. And you may be thinking that the Vikings act almost how they want, and I would disagree with that, because although they aren't necessarily bound to something physical, they're not bound as slaves per se through most of the war arc, but they are bound to, as I've also said, these self-destructive behaviors. They are bound to hedonism, they're bound to loot, they're bound to desires, and so they are led on by this, and Thorfinn comes in very nicely as he is bound to honor, and that is who he directs this to. But obviously there are a few differences between Thorfinn and the rest of the Vikings, but on the whole he fits that similar mold of being bound to something, and so that lack of autonomy is a lack of beauty in Askeladd's framework for aesthetics almost. I've mentioned this thing on self-destructive emotions quite a lot. I think that is an important thing that I should probably go into detail a bit more. When I say self-destructive emotions, I mean that in the context of Stoic philosophy and Stoicism. A good place to start in relation to Roman Stoicism, which I do believe that Askeladd takes most of his beliefs from, is Seneca. Seneca is, I don't want to go into a whole history lesson, I'll be honest, I don't know massive amounts of Seneca, but Seneca was a very influential Stoic, and it's one of the more famous ones alongside Zeno and Marcus Aurelius. But I think what is more important than the history lesson is what Seneca actually had to say, or at least what is the basis of Stoic philosophy and how does Askeladd fit into this. And so from what I understand of Stoic philosophy, it is one, good to note that this is a behavioral philosophy, or one of which is very based on the human character and the individual's emotions and how they're able to control those in relation to the almost uncontrollable world around them. There seems to be this system in regards to Stoicism, which usually concerns itself with only being able to control your own character and not the world, and so you use hardship and this uncontrollable world to instead practice virtue and almost release your potential as the best person you can be. Part of that does involve getting rid of these self-destructive behaviors or moderating them. As a result of this uncontrollable world, but being able to control your character and almost master your character, that is where stuff like not fearing death are quite important. Not fearing death is something that we should be quite familiar with in relation to Askeladd, because boy, look what happened to him at the conclusion. But these things are, one, things that we're able to see within Askeladd as a character himself, and so I can very much respect how Askeladd is written not only to propose a philosophy and nuance the commentary as to what is beauty after Canute, but he's also very good at practicing his own philosophy, or at least he does label himself a hypocrite by the end of the speech in episode 22. However, by the end, and when he does die at the conclusion of Vinland Saga, or the war arc of Vinland Saga, he does prove his own philosophy correct, and that does show a lot of attention to detail. I don't really want to talk about how brilliant the writing is, because that isn't really the focus of this episode. It's kind of implied, since we are talking about the very strong philosophical layers which exist within this part of the show. And so to wrap up essentially what Askeladd is saying, it is that the Vikings lack beauty because they are bound to things. They have not been able to control their own character. They are in fact being steered by the uncontrollable and chaotic world around them. And the same applies to Thorfinn. Despite his circumstances, I do feel sorry for him. His dad did die right in front of him, but he is still bound to and not autonomous or free from the events of of the world and time as it is. He's still being driven by it rather than driving himself. As I also said, the Vikings are bound to, whether it's loot, land, bloodlust, the entire goal when you think of it is land driven. And so I guess you can even say that the narrative as a whole is one of which is underpinned by this very materialistic and uncontrollable one, rather than one which is based on self-mastery. Rather than improving as Vikings and becoming a greater set of people, it's based on obtaining more land, it's based on getting to Vinland. And so this does prove the point that this philosophy is one of which underpins the entire narrative as opposed to just a specific moment. So just to summarize that briefly, we have this massive conflict between Thorfinn, if we use him as the test subject, as he is the one being told this. He is the one who has this uncompromising personality, and he has this obsession for honor and revenge almost on Askeladd, versus Askeladd's philosophy, which entails that in order to be autonomous, you need to let these things go. Just to round the point home a bit, I think it is good to do a bit of analysis in relation to Thorfinn's psychology. I'm not going to be able to do some sort of Freudian psychoanalysis or anything, but I think it is important to look at what he said in his approach, and it's quite a simple approach. He believes that if we look at this from a utilitarian-esque perspective, he believes that defeating Askeladd will maximize utility for himself and also for his predecessors, those that died for him, aka Thors. He believes that he will achieve fulfillment by doing this, and so that will liberate him, that will grant him the autonomy, but that is in direct contradiction with Askeladd's philosophy, that is the block. The block is Thors and that notion of honor, whereas Thorfinn sees this as backwards. But there is slightly more to this, and that is, I would say, the much more larger reason why this is a problem, or why you can argue that this is problematic for Thorfinn's character. And the reason for this is that he fails to take up an almost long-terminist position. He fails to acknowledge the wider scale of things. Because of this simple fixation of maximize utility by killing Askeladd, I will be liberated and so I can move forward, he is too busy staring at the block being Thors and honor, rather than what comes afterwards. And if we turn this on its head, Askeladd does have that long-terminist position of history. We see this in multiple ways throughout the series, and one of my favorite ways for acknowledging, and this is something I love as someone that enjoys history quite a lot and someone who is studying history quite a lot, I love this view of history as this massive thing that's more than just a line. It's this influx, I don't even know what to call it, but it's just this influx chamber of events, almost waiting to be changed every time by every influential being of which comes onto the earth. And as I was saying, sorry I got a bit off track there, the best place for this, I would say personally, is the conclusion to the series. It's that knife scene. And I did hear that the knife did not happen within the manga, and sure, I can understand that the conclusion did feel a bit like a teaser for season 2, or the second season. But I think it also does acknowledge something a lot bigger than that, and that is the impact of which Askeladd had on history, and how he's able to influence the course of history as it is, changing its course from what seemed to be a lot more deterministic as to get to Vinland and get the material, to now influencing how all of that will happen and influencing the behavior of an individual, multiple individuals. In the entire world in the Dark Ages has been arguably influenced by Askeladd, and the knife does show that very well, I would say. I do think that Askeladd is smart, and many have acknowledged it. I'm not the first person to say that Askeladd's a very smart character, but I think that a lot of that discourse does stop after a while. It's the fact that he was able to choose both, and I agree, that is very smart. But I think the very, very, very big smart thing about Askeladd, I don't even know if that made sense, but I'm excited. The biggest brain thing about Askeladd is he's literally gone against an entire cultural mentality that is being driven by the material, driven by materialism, which is, as I've said previously, loot, land, everything. I think being able to do that versus an entire almost world which is full of the material and fixation with materialism. This was a time to carve land for yourself. This was the massive land grab of history. And so being able to go against that, I think, is a very big deal. You're surrounded shoulder to shoulder by people that believe this, and you might show it yourself even at times. But being able to deviate from that and critique that, I think, takes a lot of character from Oscar. I'm talking about him almost as if he's a person, because I feel like he is. And the fact that he applied his own philosophy for his own death, as I've said, fearing death is something which is very big in the Stoic tradition. Or I do mean not fearing death is a big thing in the Stoic tradition. The fact that he was able to do that for changing these hidden course of history is something which is legendary, that I don't think I've ever seen a character in almost any show or anime do. You can maybe be technical about it and say Steins Gate because that is the literal flow of time, but conceptually changing the tide of history is something which is very noble. That is more noble than anything else, really, in my opinion. I now want to change the course slightly of my analysis, and that isn't because I think it's going in a bad direction, but I think there are other things which should also be addressed, and one of them is this notion of dualism. Dualism is, if not one of the biggest themes as well as beauty in Vinland Saga, and at least the war arc anyway, because that's all I've seen. And so dualism, this duality or notion of one or the other, I think that's the easiest way to explain it, underpins a lot of this arc because it underpins the contrasting philosophy of Askeladd and Canute, but even the activities which take place in the show. So a good example is the girl in the ring, fearing of which she's going to go to hell because she stole a ring, and so this will come more into play in part 2, but that dualism notion is something which we should be thinking about because we can apply it to Askeladd and how, which I will go on to now, how he smashes that or how he spits in the face of dualism. The way in which he quote-unquote spits in the face of dualism is quite simple, and he does this through not choosing either Wales or Canute. And similarly in relation to aesthetics, he, with his almost negative take on it, he doesn't really answer the question. Askeladd is a character, from my understanding, which leaves things almost in the realm of subjectivity. He isn't commenting necessarily on what it is, he's leaving that almost for you to determine and how you can evolve your character to do so, as that would apply to Thorfinn, for example. But even in relation to dualism, he doesn't choose one or the other, and he smashes that, because history is in flux. I did say turn the tide, but does turn the tide mean go to the other end? No, it doesn't. Unlike Canute's commentary on what beauty is, it does take place in a much more objective manner. I will get to that in part 2, but it does take place in this much more rigid framework, that is, God is the most beautiful. But Askeladd, a good thing to note is that he doesn't actually answer the question. If anything, although inversely he does answer it by saying full autonomy is beauty. Beauty in its maximized form is when one is truly free from everything, free from the shackles of hedonism, free from the shackles of grabbing land and loot. But he doesn't directly answer the question, and if anything, he only nuances the debate a lot more. Maybe we can say, and this will maybe make sense after I talk about Canute, but maybe we can say that Vinland Saga doesn't only use and comment on dualism and aesthetic philosophies through just pitting these two characters against each other in their mindsets, but also by balancing their philosophies between objectivism and subjectivism. This is a time of which aesthetics is being carved out, and so it would make sense for it to be that way. Subjectivism is more in relation to beauty, something which we talk about now a lot more today, so postmodernist discourse would mostly be based on, and its main element is based on the denial of an objective reality, and so subjectivism is something which is a little more prominent today anyway. But balancing these two together, I think, just to get on track, I think balancing the two together is very smart. And it's weird how they don't make a direct clash, because I would have loved to see that. I would have loved to see a clash of these two philosophies, but they are very contradicting anyway. And it'll be interesting to see how Canute progresses with this one. I do also find it very interesting that when the show, as I've touched on before, is based heavily on this straight goal, this very objective goal. It is literally an objective. It is get to Vinland, create a good society, and be prosperous. But Askeladd changes that tide and that course to what is the character required to get there, as I've touched on. Thorfinn is the subject of this. How does Thorfinn need to change in regards to mentality to achieve this goal, as opposed to just having the goal there? And so I think the war arc overall is a good way, or Askeladd's contribution to the war arc is influencing the tide of the narrative and influencing or complicating this, what seemed to be a very simple goal, which was, although yes, complicated by it being historical anime and there were a lot of facts and everything, but at least from a thematic level, he complicates it in a good way when it comes to the goal of reaching Vinland. I think it's really interesting and really awesome how Vinland Saga almost models how philosophical discourse takes place. Canute's philosophy and almost theological outlook on beauty and all of that comes a lot before episode 22 of Vinland Saga, when Askeladd gives his speech. But having a point of disagreement and having a criticism or a critique, not a direct critique, but a critique nonetheless, on Canute's notions of aesthetics is really effective, and it feels a lot more to the core. I did hear people saying that this is philosophy for the sake of philosophy. I don't feel as if some would be able to, or writers would be able to take this that far to the extent of which they want to disagree and change the course of the discourse itself. And so this does just, again, factor into how the Dark Ages, I think, are being very influential in the course of history. It's a time of which these discourses and conversations can mold philosophy in itself, although no, Canute is not a philosopher, no, Askeladd is not a philosopher, but these conversations are ones of which are good to be had at this time in history. And so piling these together, I think, is a lot smarter of a move than introducing one and leaving it there. And so just to end this episode really, or just to end this before we go on to the In The Moment segment, as well as just all the philosophy, I think the probably most valuable thing that has come out of the war arc of Vinland Saga, and I'll probably repeat this next episode, is that Vinland Saga acknowledges history from a way of which I don't usually think many other historical anime recognize it. It recognizes it in the conceptual sense and the almost academic sense, not necessarily the scientific sense, which is history is this constant forever flowing thing underpinned by time and space. And no, it's not that. It's more in relation to a construct which can be changed, and there are many other views of history. Vinland Saga takes a view of history that it is not linear. History does not just keep progressing. In fact, it can be influenced, and there are almost ebbs and flows which take place within that. And the Vikings, Askeladd, and everyone else serve a part in the war arc in doing that. So that is the analysis for this week. Hopefully you did enjoy that. Hopefully it wasn't too waffly. Next episode or next part, I will be going on to Canute's philosophy. There will be a bit more religion in there because Canute is religious and he talks about it in relation to Christianity. I just thought that this episode would be too long if I was to do basically this level of analysis again for Canute, so I will be doing that next episode. But for now, let's go into the In The Moment segment for this week, talking about one anime which I have been enjoying quite a lot recently. It honestly feels like I haven't done an In The Moment segment in basically forever because I was doing Beyond Konoha for the past 3 weeks, so it feels kind of weird, but it's nice to be back on the In The Moment segment. I do enjoy talking about what I've been watching. So I've watched loads of things, so I'm just going to pick out one, and one of them which I have probably found the highlights and maybe what you can consider a hidden gem in anime would be Tetsuan Birdie Decode. the intention for it, as well as a lot of series recently, has been to watch for the purposes of learning and studying animation. I don't mean it from the animator's perspective. It's not my intention at the moment to learn how to animate, but I would maybe call myself an enthusiast at least. And so Tetsuan Body Decode was an anime which I had seen quite a lot on Twitter and all that, and it's not one which is spoken about very much, but it was something I really wanted to watch because I wanted to see how much potential it had from an animation perspective. And I have been really impressed. I don't want to go through all of the plot. Just know that it's about a boy and a girl, the girl being kind of an alien. She looks human though, and this boy called Stomo, not the Stomo we spoke about in the last episode though, but Stomo in a wild accident eventually gets merged with this girl called Birdie, or this alien girl called Birdie, and they have to live their life together and they have to manage it. They can swap out bodies, but they can't necessarily be out at the same time. It is a long explanation, but I'm not going to go into that. But overall, I think Tetsuan Body Decode is a nice story. I am on the second season. I've almost completed it. In regards to animation, I'm very impressed. We have a lot of talented animators, and a few animators have become my favorites because of this show. We have Tomoyuki Niho, we have Norio Matsumoto, the Naruto legend, we have Shingo Yamashita, we have Ryotimo, we have loads of amazing animators. We have Hironori Tanaka. If you don't know that name, you should. If you search Hironori Tanaka Bleach Hellverse, that is probably the most legendary scene from him, I would say personally. But if you want to identify him, that is probably the scene to do so. So many talented animators on this work. I did not regret it. There are some more interesting choices in some places, but overall I would say that it's a great work for learning about a bunch of animators and some really talented ones. Yamashita, or Shingo Yamashita being one of them. Norio Matsumoto. I would recommend also watching Naruto if you want to learn a bit more about Matsumoto, but I would say it's still a very good place too. And also Tomoyuki Niho as well. So if you do want to watch something for animation purposes, I would recommend that. I am going to be watching a bunch more shows in relation to that. Like right now I'm watching Yozakura Quartet. I'm going to probably be watching Denokoyo and Rolling Girls soon. And so there are a bunch of shows I want to watch for animation purposes. But that doesn't mean I'm not going to be looking at them from a narrative point of view as well. I might even do a review someday of Tetsuan Body Decode because I really do feel passionate about this show. But that is it for the In the Moment segment. It was a bit of a wishy-washy one, I'll be honest. I just wanted to get something in, hopefully keep you guys informed in regards to what I'm watching, because I haven't told you guys what I've been doing for a very long time. And so finally, let's just go into some closing thoughts in relation to Vinland Saga's philosophy, or more specifically Askeladd's philosophy. So what are some of the main takeaways for this episode? I would say that there are probably three things. The first is this stoic approach to beauty and aesthetics which Askeladd takes. He believes that a lack of beauty derives from a lack of autonomy, and as a result, what one can do is refine their own character. We can imply this adversedly because he doesn't necessarily state you need to be this, but you can take from that or reverse engineer it to then say that you need to become autonomous and hence refine your own character and practice virtue in order to achieve said goals that you want to, and in this case, reach Vinland and feel liberated after the death of your father being Thor's, in relation to Thorfinn. The second is his attack on dualism and dualistic philosophy, if you want to call it that, or just dualism as a whole. Askeladd doesn't really make an attempt to join a side and say that you should be one or the other. In fact, he almost contributes to the realm of subjectivity by almost nuancing the debate a lot more in regards to aesthetics and beauty. And finally, Vinland Saga acknowledges history as this much more nuanced concept. It's not just based on space-time and the constant flow of time, but it's something to be molded, it's something to be controlled by influential people in history. And Askeladd definitely takes that in his own hands and decides to change history by himself. So that was part 1. Now let's go on to part 2 of the Vinland Saga What is Beauty analysis.
Previously on Get In The Mecha.
There seems to be this system in regards to Stoicism, which usually concerns itself with only being able to control your own character. Lacking beauty comes from an almost lack of autonomy, a lack of personal autonomy. And so to wrap up essentially what Askeladd is saying, it is that the Vikings lack beauty because they are bound to things. They have not been able to control their own character.
This is Get In The Mecha, the weekly anime and manga show where we take things one step further. I analyze everything from arcs to OPs to episodes in my wacky but enjoyable quest to make sense of all of it.
Welcome back to Get In The Mecha. I'm your host Jamal today, and in today's episode, we continue our look through what is beauty in Vinland Saga. Last episode we looked quite closely at Askeladd's philosophy, and in today's episode I will be presenting you with my analysis of Knut. This episode is going to feature a bit more to do with religion and Christianity, as Knut does speak about it in that context, but I will also be addressing how this almost counteracts, or at least compares to Askeladd's philosophy, not necessarily in quality, but how it does almost as a critique, or at least a counterpart to Askeladd's philosophy. I am assuming you have listened to part 1 of this. If you haven't, I would highly recommend it, as I will be comparing a lot of the context which we discussed, and referring to a lot of the context I referred to in part 1. But without further ado, let's get into the episode for this week. This is episode 47 of Get In The Mecha, a continuation into our look into what is beauty in Vinland Saga. Before we dive into the analysis, I think it is important that I do say spoilers for the war arc of Vinland Saga. I have also mentioned this in part 1, which I also said I highly do recommend listening to. So I will just reiterate, just in case, I'm sure you got the message, that is spoilers for the war arc of Vinland Saga. If you are unaware of where the war arc is, that is the first season, or the content of the first season of the anime. And so let's get into the analysis regarding Knut's philosophy. A place I do want to start today is speaking a bit about beauty in general and how this kind of varies from a lot of the discourse we often know about beauty. Beauty in today's discourse is often seen, and we take it for granted, as subjective. In almost any discussion in regards to art, if someone is to say, your opinion is wrong, someone will counter it by saying art is subjective, or we can even go along the almost cliche phrase, beauty is in the eyes of the beholder, and that is in summary what beauty and the conversation around it revolves around almost. We get this on a very casual level, but we also get this on a very philosophical level in some cases, and some very academic discussions in regards to literature and art, etc. A lot of it is based on this notion of the opinion and subjectivity, and that applies just as much to beauty as it does art, and that is because we are looking at aesthetic philosophy. Often, and this is kind of a thing we see in the anime community, it's kind of, I don't take it seriously, but if we are to put it in the context of what we will be discussing today, if someone is to say, my opinion is objectively right, they will be met with this, opinions are subjective, you are stupid, because art and beauty are subjective experiences. It's down to me and my personal taste when it comes to evaluating these things. And ironically, the objectively right route is often seen as wrong. It's kind of weird because that is objective in itself, but that is usually what it's met with. But when we do speak about the philosophy of Vinland Saga and aesthetic philosophy in Vinland Saga, we have to remember the almost historiography or development of philosophy in regards to aesthetics. And this isn't to say, and I don't think I'm in the place because I have not studied philosophy, I should make that clear, but the conversation about aesthetics in regards to subjectivity and surrounding this subjective reality when it comes to it hasn't advanced to what we know it is to have been or what we know it as today.
And so the emphasis on subjectivity isn't necessarily going to be as strong in Canute's words in regards to beauty, because there are multiple other forms of reasoning and philosophical discourse to back up what he's saying, and that isn't necessarily postmodern discourse where we get this notion of subjectivity from often. And so now I think it is important to address what exactly Canute is saying when it comes to his almost shining moment in Vinland Saga, when he addresses and tries to understand what is beauty and what is love when he's confronted with the death of Ragnar as he's having the conversation with the priest. And so Canute and the priest basically allude to using their almost religious perspective that beauty can be found and maximum beauty can be obtained only through reconciling with their Father, God. Beauty is found through regaining this connection with God, and only when one is reconciled they can reach this maximum state. The reasoning for this and the reasoning behind this is actually quite thick, and I would say one of the main reasons for this boils down to this notion of original sin. Original sin is this idea that humans are innately going to sin. It's the natural human tendency to sin, and hence that implies that we are naturally flawed and we are naturally imperfect. This can be tracked down to the fall in the Bible when Adam and Eve failed God in the Garden of Eden when they gave into temptation. And as a result, this brought sin to the world. So when we look at both the apple imagery and the way Canute expresses and the way the priest expresses that death is beautiful, that is all referencing to that. And it also references to the fact that death is a almost good thing, you can argue. Death isn't something to be feared. We did talk about this kind of in relation to the Stoic tradition, but in relation to Christianity, the ability to escape sin and the ability to escape suffering and the ability to escape doing wrong is seen as an opportunity rather than a downfall. It's seen as not a pessimistic thing, not a disadvantage, but in fact an opportunity to become one and reconcile with God our Father. I think a really easy way of phrasing it is that you aren't able to sin when you are dead. You don't have the ability to do wrong and betray and go against God's creation. We will speak about God's creation later in today's episode, but you belong in His hands. You belong in heaven now, if we assume you do go to heaven. If you do have a dualist view of the afterlife, if we are going to go into that, which I will go into. A lot of this imagery is very strong. As I also said, we do get the apple imagery, and we also get the environment around us. We get a very big sense of what God's creation is. And so the almost theological aspect or the religious aspect of then and the past is mixed quite well with today's environment, and how that all coincides together is that it is all within God's creation. This is God. I think it's quite appropriate to refer to the context. If you were listening to part 1, and as I did say, this does heavily relate to the fact that we are in the Dark Ages. This is not only just an attempt to build up on aesthetics, which I've discussed for most of part 1 as well as today, but it's also an attempt to build on the religious aspects of this world of which we're trying to understand, and also building upon, in the almost sense of within Vinland Saga, building up religion amongst them and spreading this information, because Christianity as we know and its development is quite eerie between this time. And what I mean by eerie isn't necessarily that we don't completely know how Christianity is developed, but there are still almost gaps. The Dark Ages is the gap in history. And so seeing this grow and evolve and have these questions answered and discussed is very important for Christianity and the Christian and almost religious element of Vinland Saga as a whole. One of the important things that the War Arc attempts to do is to constantly layer these elements, these theological, these religious, these philosophical elements, and I did say that the discourse needs to move on, or I thought that the discourse should move on in relation to this being just the world building arc, and I call this more the theme building arc or the philosophy building arc to be almost overly extravagant about it. But it is important to emphasize that this is very important for this notion of world building. I think it would be very weird to talk about this time period without actually referring to the spread of religion and the growth of these, what can be referred to as less rational beliefs. I want to move on to address something which I did talk about quite a bit in part 1, and that is dualism. But I do think that in relation to Canute, and not even just Canute, because the conversation in regards to Christianity and the commentary in regards to religion extends a lot further than just Canute himself, and I do want to kind of cover all the bases here. And so when we talk about dualism, I think it is important to establish how Canute and the Christian discussion in Vinland Saga, especially his, pushes back on this idea in itself. The show demonstrates the problem of dualism, or it almost critiques dualism in a passive sense. It shows what is wrong with it, or what it can do to people who, and it was most definitely a reality of the time to buy into dualism, mostly because of this belief of the Old Testament, which was very brutal in its terms. We have an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. Very harsh words. God is seen as this omnipotent figure, this, although we can argue loving, but that does really come into the New Testament, and that kind of fits into Canute's discussion. But when we think of this more dualistic and hardcore look at Christianity, this does derive a lot from the earlier episodes. The problem with dualism is that it doesn't discriminate. It doesn't have these different gradations of which actions and sins are judged. If anything, everything which is considered bad in any sense is the complete bad. It's taken to its logical conclusion. And the perfect example of this is the girl with the ring. I don't know if I discussed this last time, but the girl with the ring feels almost like a thought experiment in Vinland Saga. It's an attempt to critique dualism and show how this can evolve from what it is there to how we can get to something greater and something which potentially is a lot more loving and benevolent for the people of the Dark Ages. In the case of the girl with the ring, stealing a ring is seen as just as bad as murder and rape and everything else. Everything bad you can think of is just as seen as the things which are considered as petty in today's context. If I was to steal water from a shop, which I wouldn't, but if I was to steal water from a shop, this is equal to genocide, for example. They are all seen and classified by this one term, which is the bad. Whereas the good is seen as the good, and that's all. They are split equally, if that sort of makes sense. There are two sides, but there aren't any different extents it can be measured by. And so I do think Canute's scene, as well as a lot of the other conversations in relation to religion and Christianity, relate heavily to this almost battle or conversation or argument, I think that's a good word, or disagreement between anti-dualism, if that even makes sense, and dualism. And as I said earlier, and I won't really go into the whole thing, this is mirrored between this almost conflict in the wording of the Old Testament and the New Testament. An eye for an eye versus turn the other cheek. Love thy neighbor versus pick up the sword. I know I'm not necessarily saying these in context, but I just want you to understand the almost different spins that these versions of the Bible take on God and almost his stance in relation to how humans should behave. This is a bit more of a personal take on this conflict between dualism and anti-dualism, and I do like that it is present, and I'll give the show credit for that, but personally I would say that the conflict is kind of slightly contradictory, and my reasoning behind that, or my opinion behind that, is that love itself is still presented as quite dualistic. When we do learn about what is love from this new standpoint that the priest brings out of Canute, it's presented as if God is all-loving and humans don't have the ability to love. I think that's quite dualistic in itself, that one has the full ability and potential to perform an action or perform love, whereas the other just is robbed of it completely. I thought that that was a bit weird, mostly because when we think of almost the human imperfection, the natural human imperfection which comes from original sin, I don't think that would remove completely or destroy completely the ability to love, but that is just my take on it. I'm still happy with how it is, and I can't really fault it for that, but that is just my view of how it comes across. This framework, no matter my opinion, I think does come across as quite objective, and this is something which is most definitely a contrasting element versus Askeladd's philosophy, as we discussed. This is a very set in stone way of how to love and what is beauty. Beauty is God. God is the ultimate form of beauty, and humans are not beautiful. God's creation is beautiful. The human creation, because of its flaws, is not. And that is also, I did say at the beginning, despite my take on it, but that is what I'm talking about. It is still very dualistic nonetheless. So it does maybe run in a bit of circles, but maybe that is the point anyway. This is still a philosophy and point of view which is developing over time, and so to expect it to be perfect, I don't necessarily mean the narrative sense, but I mean more in the literal sense. To expect it to be perfect isn't reasonable, I don't think, because we are in the Dark Ages. Christianity is developing. Christianity hasn't moved on to the extent to which we know today, or further than that. So expecting these conversations to be had and maybe have a few quirks in them maybe is a benefit which I can give to them. Just to almost summarize this objective framework which we have for beauty, just to summarize the way of which this is an almost objective philosophy, well, it comes across as objective, is how we have this almost set in stone framework for Christians to use when it comes to how beautiful one is. You are your most beautiful when you are dead. Beauty is maximized when you reach God, when you are dead, when you are reconciled with your Father, when He has full control over His creation. And that creation, being the human being, isn't committing chaos. They aren't being a wild Viking doing whatever they want. If you argue that free will is a real thing, that is another debate for another time. But you reach this maximum state when you are out of control of oneself. It is kind of in reverse to Askeladd's philosophy when we think of it. It is kind of in reverse, or in reversal to the Stoic view of it, which is controlling your character. You have the full ability and you want to maximize your control of your own character, since you can't control the rest of the world, and it is your attempt to become virtuous. But Canut's way of thinking kind of overwrites this, or I should maybe say the priest's way of thinking, but their way of thinking overwrites what Askeladd says, which is that we don't have the full ability to control our character, and if anything, our character is flawed to a degree, and so the human character isn't something which is perfectible. Askeladd, in summary, or I'm almost paraphrasing, is that one's character is for the molding. You have the ability to do this and you ought to do it because it's the best thing to do to achieve your aims, and in order to maximize the pleasure of what you get out of life and achieve one's goals. I don't know if he says that directly, but we can kind of get that from it, especially when we think of Vinland Saga as this materialistic narrative. That is what he attempts to do, to almost nuance that notion. But when we look at Canute and the priest, it's very skewed. It's almost opposite. It's you don't have control, and so you may commit these acts, and you may be flawed, but you will regain control, or at least God will do the controlling for you when you are in His loving care. The final thing I want to get onto is this notion of God's creation. I have referred to this a heavy amount today, but it is something very important to this philosophy, and it does extend to a bit more what you can define as tangible philosophy. This is a philosophy episode after all, and I do want to give you a bit more genuine philosophical context if you do want to read into it, and so that really comes from this thought of idealism. From what I do understand of idealism, it refers to how ideas are the only true way to capture the essence of the material. And we kind of see this sort of thought within the way Canute refers to the world and God's creation. He refers to the wind and the rain. He refers to the sky and the snow. He refers to these material items, the world around it, but it's the idea which is behind it which is so valuable. Firstly, God's creation is seen as the most beautiful. God and everything of which He created, which is classified as the material, is the absolute and almost objective source of divine beauty. And secondly, a good way to trace this back in regards to real philosophy is Platonic idealism. Plato has spoken a lot about idealism and his whole theory on forms and everything. And I'm gonna be honest, I don't know too much in regards to Plato. I haven't read enough, I would say. But when I was reading, I did find out that Plato is almost compatible with Christianity when it comes to idealism in some aspects. The way this can be interpreted when it comes to idealism and the true essence of ideas being encapsulated within the material is when we add God to the equation and when we suggest that God's creation and the material is a reflection of a perfect abstract reality. It's that perfection, it's that perfect form, and this is where perfection in Vinland Saga really does come in quite well. It is the perfection of the substantial, as Plato refers to it, I believe, or these ideas, that is a lot more valuable than the material in itself. And so beauty in God is almost reinforced as it being the highest form, I would say. Although we kind of already know that through his context and what he refers to as God and how he almost cares so much about God in general, as well as the priest, I think it is important to establish that this only reinforces God as the highest beauty. And I guess it also does reinforce that he is the most powerful as well, because his essence is in everything. I think I even did overlook this myself, but the fact that he is in everything does demonstrate his power, God's power, and God in everything. And hence that power is something which should be respected and something that should be admired by those who follow Christianity. And so just to wrap that up, Plato's idea of idealism and Platonic idealism can help us understand how God's perfection is in everything. God's perfection is everywhere, and the fact that it is everywhere shows how much of an omnipotent being he is, and the fact that he is, yes, this highest beauty and the biggest influence on human beings. We've spoken quite a lot, and I don't think I'm going to do an In the Moment segment this week, just because I think I did do one last week, and there is quite a lot to digest from this episode. And so I would much rather go to closing thoughts and give a very big and thorough look at what this really means, and summarizing the past 2 episodes. I think that is a bit more valuable than talking about Yozakura Quartet, which I have been watching recently. And so I'm going to kind of address what is the value of this philosophy. I have waffled on quite a lot today as well as last week about how good this is, but it's what does it do and why does it classify as good in my opinion? Firstly, I think it's important because it raises this very important question as to what is human nature, who are we, and how beautiful are we, how can we control this beauty? I think a maybe even better way of phrasing it, rather than me throwing loads of words around, is what is the character which we need in this narrative? And how capable are the characters in this narrative to achieve this material aim of getting to Vinland? This comes out of this, yes, I did say it's about human nature, but what comes out of this and what stems out of it is this notion of perfection. Askeladd suggests that we almost are perfectible. The world isn't necessarily perfect around us, but we have the ability to perfect ourselves and improve ourselves. He does this through referring to Stoic philosophy. This desired state of beauty is one of which is reachable, it is possible to achieve, whereas Canute is quite negative in this sense. The human character is something which can't be perfected. We have to accept these flaws. We don't have the ability to love. And who does? Who has the ultimate ability to love? That is God. God almost has full control. He is the all-powerful and the all-loving. And so the human character is non-malleable. It is fixed, and so I think the ultimate value, and I think the thing I really want you to take away if you have listened to these 2 parts, thank you so much if you have listened across the past 2 weeks, that these philosophies and these insights aren't here for no reason. If anything, the true value of these is that they make Vinland Saga transcend a materialistic narrative. I addressed it quite a lot in part 1, and that is that Vinland Saga is based on the material. Get to Vinland, start a society, collect resources, become strong, win the land grab. However, with these philosophies, we question the underlying thing which will influence how this materialistic narrative is reached, and that is the characters. They are the almost mechanism or engine which will achieve this, or can potentially achieve this and bring this goal into fruition or into existence. This almost toggles the linear narrative which we're used to, or the linear narrative which it initially appears to be. This seems like a simple goal of marching through England and Wales, etc. to achieve the same. But this almost XY linear narrative is distorted when we learn that the human character does not have the ability to achieve this in a linear fashion. And this character is going to have to change, or is innately flawed when it comes to trying to achieve this. I think this just sets up for a lot more of a volatile narrative, or one of which isn't very predictable, because the beauty of individuals will influence how this narrative goes down, and how the human character is in its nature and form will influence and distort this linear narrative getting to Vinland. And so it does maybe point to the centrality of these characters and how important each and every character is, and the character of these characters or these people will be when it comes to achieving the central goal.
Thank you for tuning into this episode of the podcast, an old episode in fact, but I hope you did get some value and enjoyed, especially if you haven't listened to it before. I will see you next week. I don't really have much to plug here. As always, if you want to get these podcast episodes delivered to you as soon as they come out, then feel free to press the bell and subscribe and do all of those YouTube-y things. And then if you are interested in listening on audio, or at least on the RSS feeds, then it would be lovely if you did leave a review saying what you think of the show there as well. But that is it, and I will hopefully see you next week on a new episode of Get In The Mecha.
The music in this production goes as follows: 8-bit title screen by Joth, mandatory overtime by Joth, difference by chasersgaming, and Anomaly by Matyas under soundimage.org.